Delighted to welcome our first speaker, Rachel Rich from Leeds Beckett, who's going to talk to us, introduce the project as well, and talk to us about the wonderful dinners and menus at Kew, and how that relates to nationalism and national identity. Rachel.
Right. Okay. Well, the project, the two papers that we're presenting this evening are related to each other and are both part of a British Academy funded project titled European Cuisine and British Identity in the Age of Nationalism, so 1760 to 1837. And we applied for this funding under a scheme called Tackling the UK's International Challenges. I think we were we were the quirky choice there amongst a lot of projects that were much more political in nature, but basically we were thinking a lot about Brexit at the time when we applied, and we have gone on thinking about what it means to be or to eat British, and in particular we've framed a lot of the project around the question of whether it's possible to be British without also being European at the table. In answering the questions around Britishness, we've focused on the importance of food as a marker of national identity in sort of two interrelated ways. So there's the kind of old standard you are what you eat idea, which I think made sense to contemporaries who still operated on assumptions from the humoral theory about the porous boundaries between the self and the substances it came into contact with. And then second, the more sort of tangible question of what actually people ate, where the ingredients were coming from in particular, so what their diets were made up from. And in both cases, we found that the king's dinners and the food served to his household offered us a rich source for thinking about food and the place of Britain in the world. And I do have a little slide about George III, just because I wasn't sure who would be here. And the last time I spoke about this was in France, and not everyone knows who George III was. But also, I like this image of Farmer George, which he was sometimes called because of his interest in agriculture. So there's Farmer George. So rather than presenting a sort of fully formed argument today, what I'm proposing is to outline some of our preliminary findings so far, and we're not even halfway through the period of funding, so a bit of work in progress. But we've been thinking a lot about all the ingredients that appear in the Royal Menu Ledger from Kew, which is what we're working on, and what those ingredients can tell us about Britain's place in the world. So, for example, we're asking what were the European influences, and were they more prevalent than other more global influences? We also started to think a lot about public perceptions of what the king and his household ate. So we're looking at political satire, and I'll show you some examples of that. And we're also looking at published cookbooks to gain a better understanding of what people outside the royal household were eating, British people, and how this might compare to what the royal household expected to find at their tables. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is kind of how when you read histories, you can read sort of histories of royalty or the court or courtly life, or you can read social histories of, the middling sort or working people, but there isn't a lot of like all the way up and down kind of social history. And so I'm starting to wonder whether food might be the way of thinking about the nation in a more joined up way. So this is the ledger that we are working on. And early modern historians take a keen interest in ledgers and account books, as I've been learning. And as our awareness increases of the kind of power and politics that go into creating archives, historians are seeking to understand what these lists mean and how they might be more contested than how they initially appear quite transparently as lists. The record of food purchased and served at Kew hints at complex interactions that lie behind the initial decisions, which are then recorded in the ledger. So the king appears both as a powerful actor, obviously, but also as subject to other people's beliefs and agendas. And I think that in Lisa's talk, you'll find out more about how sort of contemporary medical knowledge was shaping the king's diet. Most obviously, the ledger shows us the intersection between the history of food choices and of food as an economic commodity. So the idea that like the tastes of the royal family might be playing into what was being served to them, but that there was also questions around cost and availability, so more practical questions that had to compete with just the question of taste. So the ledger was written by the clerk of the kitchen, whose job it was to procure ingredients, and there were regulations that determined, that this had to be done. And at the start of the ledger, At the start of the ledger, there's a list of items purchased for the palace. And there's a number of items on the list, and they're divided into the headings of grocery and oilery, which is a word I'd never heard before. I came across this, so I like it. And some of the items were already fairly commonplace in British recipes, so things like nutmeg and cinnamon, obviously sugar, salt, pepper. Others might be more indicative of the luxury available to the royal family. So there's things like Westphalia hams, which also point to the king's German origins, and I might mention that again. Or imported ingredients like rice. One of the things that appears here is Parmesan cheese. When I first moved to this country, I was assured that the British had only discovered Parmesan cheese through Elizabeth David, but it turns out that's not true. So Parmesan cheese was clearly a European flavor in the king's kitchen, and was probably not easily available to the wider public, but it wasn't totally unheard of either, for beyond the court. So, and these kind of lists of what was being purchased appear at intervals through the ledger. Once the clerk of the kitchen made his list, he had to report to the Board of Green Cloth, whose members were tasked with authorizing spending on food and drink. So rather than simply reflecting personal choices or tastes, there's a bit of a committee at work here deciding, what was being consumed and how much food could come into the house. The ledger, written out day by day, was divided into kind of tables or groups within the household. And there could be, on given days, it waxes and wanes a bit, but say up to 14 different tables in the example I've listed here from May 1801. So their Majestys' table, equerries, pages, attendants, various servants, grooms. And what's interesting is that how you can tell who was at their Majesty's table on a given day comes from whose servants were being fed. So they don't enumerate all the people that sat down with, as guests of the family. You can only discern their presence because they brought their servants, and their servants are itemized separately as being present. And sometimes it's curious what the servants get fed, because on that particular day when the princes, so the sons of George and Charlotte, are present, they eat roasted mutton like all the other servants did on that day. But for some reason, the Duke of Kent's servants has mutton from Brentford, and we don't know yet whether that signifies that he was, that those servants were being singled out for something. So there's all these like little clues to where the food was coming from that are hard to know if, how meaningful they are. So we know who was in the house because their servants had to be fed. And Adam pointed out to me when we were talking about this that it's because there were no fast food restaurants near Kew at the time, so they couldn't nip out for a burger, and they did have to be fed in the house. The main table, their Majesty's table, would be served in an à la Française style, so there were always lots of dishes at the table, and you can tell that there's a little bit more food served on days when there are extra people in the house, but you don't necessarily know who it was for, how much of it got eaten. And again, I've just got this little map of how à la Française service looks in case people aren't familiar with it. I don't know if people are. I can't tell anywhere what's kind of common knowledge and what isn't. But anyway, à la Française service is where you put out dishes in 2 usually or 3 courses, but where several dishes are on at once, and there's like maps of how they need to be laid out in very specific ways. So that's what it would look like, and everyone would sit around then and share that meal. there's other, sorry, I just want to say there's other clues about who was coming and going other than the amount of food. So for example, on days when people were planning to travel, you can see that sandwiches were being made, so people were given sandwiches to take with them on their journey. And sometimes there's like last minute notes when people are leaving or arriving unexpectedly. So there are clues about the comings and goings in the menu. The menus in the ledger are laid out in a kind of a consistent pattern with 4 columns like this, reflecting the makeup of the household, and kind of a sort of social structure as imagined, I guess, by the clerk of the kitchen, where their Majesty's table obviously is always first, so their Majesties, then the equerries, the pages, etc. And then on the 4th column is always Miss Goldsworthy, who's the governess of the princesses and the princesses. So it's like the mum and dad at the start and the princesses at the end, with all the serving people in the middle. And so it's very consistently like that. And I think it has a bit of sort of social structure then built in, sort of structure and class and gender all built into how the menu ledgers are laid out. For the adult royals and the elite inhabitants, which could include at different times the equerries, the pages, Miss Goldsworthy, etc., food was an aesthetic performance, and dishes were both named and quantified. By contrast, for those who served them, food was merely fuel, which came in amounts, but shorn of any appetizing names or descriptions. And I'm going to talk about that again in a few minutes and show you exactly what the servants were given and how it was sort of how it was described. In order to consider the significance of what was eaten at Kew and how it was recorded in the menu ledgers, it probably makes sense to say something first about what we know about what the British were eating in the late 18th century, and what people thought about what and how much they ate. And there's a difference in how British food and French food are imagined, and it seems to be part of the difference in the relationship that the British had with their monarch as compared to the relationship that the French had, for example, with their monarch. So in the French court, there were 2 actual separate kitchens, apparently. One for cuisine de bouche, which was for the French king, his family, his guests, and then a separate kitchen for preparing cuisine ordinaire for, the people who were, the rest of the household, but who weren't related to the royal family, And obviously the French have this idea of haute cuisine at the time, which is the cooking of the court, whereas that doesn't seem to exist as such a strict distinction in this country. So there seems to be like a kind of a different symbolic relationship in Britain between the king and his subjects, like a closer relationship, because the food they eat is more closely related, maybe. A number of historians have already researched the prevalence of imported ingredients at 18th century English tables. Elites, the middling sort, and even working people chose to spend money on things like sugar and cinnamon, nutmeg and mace, not to mention tea, coffee, and chocolate. To eat a British diet meant tasting the global reach of British trade, power, and influence. For historians, this can be interpreted as showing ways in which the British felt at home with the British at home felt the presence of empire in daily life. But the normalization of recipes for things like ragout and kebabs might also suggest how quickly the presence of European and global elements on the dinner table came to actually seem inherently British rather than foreign. 18th century cookbooks can offer some information about the range of foreign foods the reading public were becoming familiar with. Cookbooks are an imperfect but nonetheless useful way of building up a sense of what was available on British tables. And I thought that I would pick out an example of the kinds of foreign things that we're finding, because Lisa and I are sort of building up a spreadsheet of the kinds of recipes that are in cookbooks that are similar to what was appearing in the ledger. And there's so much overlap between what was in cookbooks. You know, it makes it seem much less special what the king was eating when you see that everyone could get recipes for them. But I just picked out to talk about today the idea of mango chutney, because basically inspired by this post which appeared in the Recipes Project by Erica Rappaport, which was about Mrs. Beeton's recipe for mango chutney, which doesn't actually contain any mango. But obviously Mrs. Beeton wrote her famous book in 1861, but the idea of a mango-less mango chutney turns out to be kind of old hat by the time she wrote it. So books like The Queen's Royal Cookery from 1713 or 1726, Cook's and Confectioner's Dictionary, offered respectively recipes for pickling nuts to eat like mangoes or to pickle codlins like mangoes. The Housekeeper's Pocketbook from 1748 and The Practice of Cookery from 1800 both offered recipes for mangoed cucumbers. And I've put a recipe up here in case anyone wants to try it. It doesn't sound awesome to me, but anyway. Cucumbers, well, you gotta spice them up a bit, I guess. But anyway, these were things that people could find how to make in their own kitchens if they were interested in kind of exotic flavors. We found in the Kew menu ledgers, you know, in terms of what the king was eating, Turkish kebabs appeared on the king's table in February of 1789. This appeared quite exotic to us at first, but we've now found that Turkish recipes for Turkish ways of cooking mutton appear in cookbooks ranging from 1726 all the way to 1800. So again, that was something that maybe people were interested in trying at home. I acknowledge, of course, that things that are in cookbooks doesn't mean anyone cooked them. More predictably, recipes for things like Italian vermicelli and macaroni and French-sounding dishes were too numerous to list because they appear in practically every cookbook we've looked at so far. And we're looking at books published from 1700 to 1850. But yeah, French things and Italian things are just not exotic. The cookbooks we're looking at are ones which were intended for a reasonably wide audience, including cooks in large households, but probably also aspirational middle-class housewives who did a lot of their own cooking. The increasing frequency of foreign-sounding dishes we're finding suggests that there was nothing notable about the royal family consuming dishes with European names or spices from further afield. But obviously the king's diet wasn't like the diets of his subjects, because his function at the head of the state meant that his body belonged to more than just himself. And George's appetites were an object of interest to contemporaries. Once he was ill, his diet became one of the nation's concerns, and doctors were frequently present at Kew during bouts of illness. But even in good health, George's food choices could attract attention and also criticism. For medical writers, both over and under eating were egregious moral failings, which caused health problems. And George was known to be a frugal and abstemious eater. And this was something that James Gillray often picked up on in his cartoons. He didn't drink alcohol, apparently, very much, George. Anyway, this cartoon, which maybe everyone has already seen, I don't know, it seems to be very well known, is called Temperance, Enjoying a Frugal Meal. And we see the king eating a soft-boiled egg while Queen Charlotte eats a salad. And their surroundings are very messy and inelegant. There's an empty picture frame on the wall and everything just looks a bit sort of squalid. So they're not eating the kind of food that you'd expect, you know, a royal couple to be able to enjoy. There's no luxury there. This even funnier image is called Anti-Saccharites, or John Bull and his family leaving off the use of sugar, from 1792. And this was because the Anti-Saccharites were a group who advocated giving up sugar to protest against slavery. And in the cartoon, George and Charlotte, and she's missing some teeth there, she looks a bit terrifying, are sort of sipping their tea without sugar, and the princesses are looking very sad to have to drink this unsweetened tea. Clearly, for satirists, you know, food choices are an easy way to symbolize moral failings, and the idea that George was not maybe a good manager of the economy, that he was too frugal, that he didn't understand his position properly. Although what was worse was to be the opposite of frugal, because Gillray saved, I think, a harsher representation for the Prince Regent, the future the future George the Fourth. Sorry, why can't I say George the Fourth? In this image called the voluptuary, where obviously he's busting out of his clothes because he's eaten so much, and there's empty wine bottles on the floor hidden under the table, and he just looks like a bit of a slob. George III's abstemiousness may have been used to suggest a lack of good taste or pride in his situation. His son's reputation for luxury and self-indulgence was seen by contemporaries as a far more dangerous failing. Indeed, the king's perceived lack of enjoyment at the finer things likely made him a more sympathetic object in the eyes of many of his mercantile and enterprising subjects. Because in a way, these cartoons about the dangers of both abstemiousness and its opposite kind of pick up on themes that medical writers were addressing to the middle classes, who were very interested in bodily self-control at that time. Food was an indicator of national identity, but also of status, gender, and taste. In the Kew ledger, the language used to describe each meal was a way of denoting rank and position. This was in keeping with the contemporary belief that the bodily needs of different social classes were distinct and ought to be so. A London magazine article from 1755 expressed the commonly held opinion that, quote, "Those who have more leisure to study what they shall eat and drink require something more in their food than what is barely wholesome or necessary. Their palates must be gratified." But it went on to say that this was not the case for common day laborers who were glad to snatch a hasty meal, because for laborers food was only fuel. When they were at Kew, the royal family tried to live as any family would in their country retreat, quietly and without too much ceremony. They tended to be there either when they had to hide away because George was ill, or when they wanted to have a bit of a cozier sort of family life. And when they were there, the meals that they ate didn't differ that much from what you might find in an aspirational middle-class cookbook. What the servants ate was very plain indeed. The servants seem to have been fed on a kind of rotating diet that just repeats itself every week, and which Adam has called the cloven hoof diet, because it's literally, this is all they ever get. It's just veal, beef, mutton, pork. So it's pretty meaty. I assume they had, a lot of, they were well fed as far as it goes. And we know the kind of portion sizes that they got. We don't really know how many people are in each box to know why the amounts are so different. Were some people getting more than others, or is it just everyone got the same, but there were more of certain kinds of people? But once you move into the kind of higher ranks, food becomes a bit more of an aesthetic event. So dishes for the Majestys, the equerries, pages, princesses, and governesses were laid out a bit more according to the rules of à la Française dining. So we can see again for the 4th of March, 1789, the veal that the servants were eating also makes an appearance at the king's dinner, but actually there's a lot more going on. So they have like a very varied diet, even if it isn't necessarily amazingly kind of remote from what other people were able to eat. And a lot of, so there's a lot of French in the menus, but French was the language for writing menus, so it's not that surprising, I guess. A lot of the foreign foods at their Majesty's table was similar to the foreign foods familiar to cookbook writing. Where I think we start to see a difference, and we've just started to kind of think about this a bit, is in terms of the German influence. So George III was obviously ethnically German, as well as being the king of Britain. He was the Elector of Hanover, and some of his food tastes were probably shaped by his German roots. And certainly his wife, the Queen Charlotte, was actually German. She had only come to England to marry the king. And so at Kew, possibly because of her taste, the head chef and the confectioner and the yeoman of the mouth were all German. And although the menu is pretty global, there are certain food choices that are clearly more German. So Westphalia ham, which I mentioned at the beginning, and Metwurst sausages, which appear frequently. And one taste that seemed to suit the royal palate, but wasn't something that ever suited mainstream Brits, as far as we can tell, was the taste for sauerkraut. So here's another Gillray cartoon of Germans eating sauerkraut. And they're eating pretty grossly. This is not like a flattering image. And so the sauerkraut is clearly kind of being used to symbolize a lack of refined taste, which maybe is a reflection on a feeling that the royal family are a bit kind of foreign and not as refined as they could be. But in as much as it was being represented in this way, the presence of sauerkraut at the royal table doesn't represent sort of access to a greater level of European luxury. It's just a kind of a taste of home, I guess. So, the Kew Ledger offers a unique and fascinating insight into how a household was fed. The king and his family, doctors, guests, aristocrats, and servants were all fed according to their rank and perceived physical needs. Choices were made about how to describe the meals served, and notes kept about what was being purchased and from whom. It cannot be said that this was a typical household, yet as the top family in the nation, the royal household might have acted as a blueprint for what it meant to be British. It's certainly clear that cookbooks intended for a broadly middle-class audience made assumptions about ingredients which suggest that while the royal family may have had more and better cooked food than their subjects, the basic building blocks and descriptions were more alike than they were different.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we'll do questions at the end, I think, because it makes logical sense we can have a proper discussion. Brilliant. So after that wonderful start, Lisa's going to carry on and talk to us about some more aspects using the what we can do with this wonderful material.
Right, so what I want to talk about is the bodies in the royal household, and I'll be thinking here about how bodies move around, which includes the food onto the table, but also the sickness and health of the nation as represented by those bodies. So themes of domesticity and intimacy are very important when thinking about the household of George III. He was no ordinary monarch in his attempts to live a relatively modest life. Janice Hadlow's recent book on the family astutely calls them the strangest family for their preference to live privately and modestly. Certainly, the well-known domestic frugality of George III was satirized, as Rachel's been talking about, but this also suggested that he might be a cheapskate in terms of matters of state. Alongside the Kew menus for December 1788 to February 1789, when the king was being treated for his first bout of mental illness, I've also examined the diaries of Fanny Burney, who was the keeper of the Queen's robes for 1788 to 89, various cookbooks and prints, and area plans for the Kew residences. The menus suggest what the bodies present in the royal household ate, or might choose to eat, and how it was closely linked to their bodily estates, which were their health, age, gender, and social status. Certain types of bodies might also be represented at the dining table. This ranged from food gifts that allowed their givers to be present virtually at the meal, to food choices that went beyond easy seasonal availability, which of course demarcated wealthy and bourgeois tables. Finally, it's helpful to consider the ways in which dining options could be used to provide intimacy or social distancing within a rather crowded domestic space. The menus reveal that the embodied status and luxury were woven throughout the family's domesticity, despite their adoption of a relatively modest lifestyle. So, first, I want to consider what bodies are mentioned in the menus, and Rachel's helpfully outlined those, and what they were eating from a humoral and health perspective. As Rachel's shown, there was a clear social strata on the menus, which are listed according to types of people, and they certainly ate a range of foods. The most variety, of course, was for their Majestys, which could easily list over 30 dishes divided across dinner and supper. My first question was whether any of these foods were clearly intended to treat mental illness or whether any dishes showed up regularly. The theory of humoral dietetics still lingered in the 18th century, which meant that certain foods might help certain conditions best. This was fading by the later part of the century, although there was still a very clear idea of sick dish cookery, foods to provide the sufferer with nourishing food that would give them strength. Hannah Glass's Art of Cookery, the 1748 edition, for example, included a chapter on directions for the sick. She provided no explanation other than providing nourishing food. She suggested dishes that included things like broths, boiled and minced meats, egg and milk-based foods, jellies, and such, and a lot of these appear on the menu. According to humoral theory, mental illness was typically thought to be caused by hot and wet humours in the head, which suggested that cooling and drying foods would be best. Of course, the patient also needed to be tempted to eat, which was especially crucial during the winter season, when dietetics aimed to strengthen the body through particularly nourishing and filling foods, even for healthy patients. It's not surprising to see on the menu that there were soups like soup julienne or soup santé. Clear broths, in particular, were known to be particularly beneficial. As the London Art of Cookery from 1789 shows, soup santé was either a clear beef and gravy broth with vegetables and herbs served over bread, or in the English way, a chicken and mutton broth with vegetables and herbs that was then served with meat in the middle. According to the professed cook from 1769, soup julienne was a good clear broth with sliced vegetables, and this could be served as gras et maigre as needed, with meat or fish. The choices that might have been intended for the king, apart from the near constant soups, are readily apparent when examining the menus. For example, on December 6, 1788, the table had foods like venison, mutton, duck, larks, partridges, turkeys, and vegetables. Perhaps the most likely meal for the king, though, was the sole with oyster sauce. Sole was considered one of the healthiest fishes, being temperate and easy to digest, while oysters were considered cooling. That said, both partridge and mutton were considered easy to digest too by early modern standards. As Thomas Moffat made clear in his book on dietetics, Health's Improvement, which was first published in 1655 and again in 1746, partridge was fit for weak stomachs and best in winter, and particularly recommended for invalids. Mutton, provided it was young, was considered appropriate for any constitution. In the middle of December, December 14th, partridges, veal, crab, pullet patties, and jelly were possible options. Jelly, of course, was nourishing and easily digested. Veal, according to Moffat, was just jelly hardened. Baby animals in general, like pullets and capons, were considered temperate and suitable for all. By February 12th, the king's health was on the mend, as reflected by the wider dish of sick dish options to tempt him. There was veal, muttons, pheasants, patty of sweetbreads and chicken loaves, which were made out of minced meats, jelly, pullet, and chicken broth. Certain dishes also appeared regularly. For example, crayfish with cream sauce. It may be that the king just enjoyed it, or perhaps somebody else at the table, but at the same time, cream was hot in the first degree, and therefore officially considered medicinal, while crayfish was considered moist in the first degree. Taken with the vegetables that regularly appear, spinach and asparagus, which were both moist in the first degree, it's also possible that such dishes were intended to be easily digested. In other words, there was a combination of warmth and moisture that would help stimulate better digestion. Of course, there's another possibility that the nourishing foods were also intended for the queen. She was steadily losing weight out of worry for her husband. By the spring of 1789, when the king was recovered, both had lost substantial weight and had aged beyond their years. The queen, for example, had always been known for her lustrous hair, but her hair had suddenly gone grey at the age of 44, which they attributed to her worries. The range of dishes on the menu, then, were not just about catering for personal preferences, but could be targeted to specific or generalized health concerns. I got so carried away. Anyhow, there's all of the jellies and things like that, and roast patties. A broad-based understanding of dietetics underpinned the rest of the menu too when it came to social status and age. As Rachel noted, lower status was reflected by the lack of choice for many of the servants. It's clear that the kitchen prepared large quantities of one type of meat each day, and these were served at most or at sometimes all of the tables. This was a practical decision, of course, and often these were the temperate meats like mutton or veal, though beef also made a regular appearance. So here we have beef appearing on all of their menus on February the 1st. Now, beef was considered gross and indigestible, except for those who had coarser constitutions, which, according to Moffat, were chiefly country persons and hard labourers, or secondarily to all that be strong of nature. Coarse bodies should not eat certain foods suited more to delicate constitutions, such as partridges. So in other words, some foods were for certain people, and other foods were better for others. Even the princesses sometimes received beef, as the menu for February the 1st shows. The princesses presumably referred to the 3 youngest daughters of the family, who ranged in age from 5 to 13 in 1788. The 3 eldest ones by this time were all adults. Their diet varied, including occasionally harder to digest meats like beef, but more typically included things like chicken, mutton, or sole, which were easily digested. Now, children, especially prepubescent ones, were thought to be porous and delicate, although they had hot temperaments, which made it possible for them to indulge in some of the less digestible foods, but only occasionally. Generally, lighter and moister foods were preferable. The menus suggest an underpinning assumption about what different types of bodies should be eating. The menus also represent virtual bodies. Food gifts came from friends, and available selections point to the king's interests and the family's high status. It's striking that throughout the menu there's references to people alongside food, and this doesn't happen all the time, so when it does, it's worth noting. For example, on the second night that the family stayed at Kew, there were 3 references to people. Mr. Powney's partridges, Mr. Schwellenberg's mutton, and Lord Cadogan's pheasants. The 3 meats appear to be judiciously chosen, temperate mutton or particularly healthful varieties of wild fowl. Mr. Powney was the MP for Windsor who was strongly supported by the king. Mr. Schwellenberg was an equerry who was not yet present, which suggests that these may have been very thoughtful choices for an ill monarch who had just relocated to Kew for recovery. The closeness of the relationships is further suggested by the rapidness with which the food appeared on the Kew table. The donors must have known quite early on that the Kew would indeed be moving to Kew, which was something that the king himself didn't know until the very last minute, as the doctors insisted on keeping it secret from him. Food gifts were frequently exchanged in early modern England to solidify patronage relationships and friendships. Food was highly symbolic, representing one's bodily estate from a distance, as well as the actual produce of one's own estate. As a result, families would keep detailed notes on food gifts or recipes sent to them, whether in household account books or recipe books. So the functions of royal menus may have been similar in this respect. After all, the clerk of the kitchen was keeping careful track of quantities of food actually prepared. Given that this was a form of domestic accounting, it does make sense that food gifts would be specifically listed. Back to Farmer George. The menus also, I think, reflect the agricultural interests of Farmer George and possibly the high-status food production methods. Now, Farmer George was depicted typically as a homespun farmer who was and this satirized his modest family life. It was also reflected, though, in the menus, which were predominantly seasonal. Shellfish might seem exotic to us now, but it was plentiful from December to February, along with turkey and wild fowl. Seasonality was less expensive and much tastier. There was even a tinge of thriftiness, though, in the fact that they were still eating mince pie and plum pudding in February, perhaps suggesting that they were finishing off the remnants of festive foods. Prudence aside, George III was also known for his interest in scientific matters, particularly those pertaining to efficient agricultural techniques that might help in building a strong nation. He was a strong supporter of the new botanic gardens at Kew, for example. In 1790, he even imported some merino sheep from Spain to found a royal flock there. Over the next 20 years, he would make over 250 gifts of those sheep across the country. Part of his goal was to make Britain less dependent on a supply of good wool from Spain. But Kew Palace also had surrounding gardens that could be used for food production. The most common vegetables listed in the menus were root vegetables, which of course is expected in the middle of winter, but more surprisingly, asparagus and broccoli. The last 2 were regularly served at the high status tables in the household. Now, asparagus and broccoli were potentially in season if you had access to glass houses, as the family did at Kew, or hotbeds. Hotbeds are a technique that involves using large quantities of manure to generate sufficient heat to grow food. In a section on seasonal foods, Hannah Glass notes that the greenhouse cauliflower and presumably broccoli, as well as hotbed asparagus and herbs, were available from December to February. It's less clear at this point how many vegetables the royal household produced, or in fact purchased from elsewhere, although Adam's been looking a lot at the provisioning. They certainly had the means and the king's interest in agriculture to at least provide some of their own foods. The food available at the table was at once plain in its seasonality, but high status in terms of its accessibility to vegetables and wild fowl. In other words, the menu reflected the estate of the king. Now, I want to turn briefly to the moving bodies of this household. The menus hint at the fact that the people were dining in different groups, but what did this actually mean in terms of space? Where was everyone? It's worth noting that even before the king's illness, the family was peripatetic. They moved between Windsor and Kew as well as other residences regularly. Kew was the centre of their private domestic life, though. The princes, when young, for example, were educated at what is now Kew Palace, and their parents regularly travelled back to see them. Kew offered the family a chance to be more private than their other palaces. Although today it's only Kew Palace and the Queen's House that remain, in 1788 the family actually had several residences at Kew. There was the main royal household of 1788, which was the White House, which is that big one there. Behind it was the Dutch House. This remained the prince's household when they deigned to visit, which was infrequent during the king's visit. So this is the Dutch House up there. The Queen also had a house in Kew, which was used in happier times for things like picnics and even more privacy. The youngest princesses and their governess and sub-governesses lived in a house on Kew Green. So in other words, they're all spread out. So here is a map of the larger area to give you a sense of what we're looking at. So the kitchen area was just off to the side of the White House. So we're looking up here. Here's the bit we're starting from. The kitchen served all the royal households at Kew as needed. Besides the massive operation of cooking for a large group of people, the kitchen staff also needed to make sure that the food was taken to several areas, often at some distance. The logistics of keeping the food warm and transporting large amounts over such a distance would have been challenging. The uses of spaces at Kew also shifted. In particular, the domestic arrangements of 1788-9 were very different from the king's second illness of 1801. By 1801, the White House had become so dilapidated that only a few recently redecorated rooms were habitable. The king was put into those rooms. In part, this gave him closer access to the kitchen and the gardens, but the Queen and his daughters lived in the more comfortable and domestic Kew Palace. This was also in part a deliberate separation. Charlotte and the rest of the family found the madness very difficult. Charlotte struggled to forgive her husband for the things said in his first bout of illness, but he also had an unsettling manner during his bouts of mental illness, with an undercurrent of violence that distressed his family. In the first bout, for example, Charlotte often slept with other people and used locked doors to prevent her husband's threatening incursions. But what about the eating of actual meals? The princesses, meaning the youngest daughters, don't always appear on the menu, especially in early December. This suggests that they were not at their Kew house yet, perhaps, or they were dining with their mother, which would reinforce family togetherness at a difficult time. And that's something that we'll be looking into. That said, their mother may have had a deliberate strategy to keep them separate from their father during his illness after the first couple of weeks. For example, on December 13th, the doctors agreed to let the king see his beloved 5-year-old Amelia for the first time since his breakdown in October, but the king terrified his daughter by grabbing her and refusing to let her go. So distancing could be necessary. Certainly the family, partly on the advice of the doctors, followed a policy of staying out of George's way. This included the layout of the residence. For example, he was given rooms on the ground floor at the front of the house. This meant he could come and go without him spotting anyone else. But this also ensured that no one had rooms directly above him, which would keep him from being distracted by anyone's footsteps. During his illness, he'd proven unpredictable whenever anyone was near, such as making inappropriate gestures to his eldest daughter or attacking his wife. The policy was perhaps to avoid attracting his attention. But despite all the attempts at physical separation, the presence of the ill king was obvious. Just after the move to Kew, Bernie wrote that she couldn't sleep. I thought I heard the poor king. He was under the same range of apartments, though far distant, but his indignant disappointment haunted me. Crucially, although the menus referred to their highnesses, the king and queen were not dining together. This raises interesting but unanswerable questions about what food items were presented at which dining tables. The king dined in his own rooms on the ground floor, sometimes with the equerries and doctors, but never with the rest of his family. The queen, along with her eldest daughters and occasionally physicians or other household members, dined at her table on the first floor. So that's where the queen would have been dining. At the same time, the White House was very crowded and required overspill into the Prince's house, or what's modern-day Kew Palace. The second floor of the White House was the location of the rooms for Mrs. Schwellenberg, a doctor, an equerry, and Frances Burney. Mrs. Schwellenberg and Burney remained constant, although the equerry and doctor rotated. Also on the second floor were servants and at least one page. At all times, at least one equerry, one physician, and one surgeon or apothecary was to be resident in the house, while the king's groomsmen were to stay in the prince's house. But where did they all eat? As Fanny Burney described in her diaries, there were other designated dining areas in the White House. For example, Mrs. Schwellenberg had spaces for tea and dining in her parlors at the front of the house. The equerries, on the other hand, had space on the other side of the ground floor. The pages also had a dining area on the ground floor, while the clerk of the kitchen and various servants also had their own spaces. This didn't mean, though, that dining only took place in those areas. Fanny Burney's diary shows the ways in which elite members of the household might establish intimacy through privacy, even within this rather crowded and chaotic household. They had their own rooms that offered options for sociability. Burney, for example, records people coming in and out of her own meals. On December 16th, Mr. Smelt came to my breakfast, which suggests that she was dining in her own rooms. This reflects the business as usual of happier times too. During the illness, the focus of Burney's diary was on the main events, but her earlier diaries point to the many shared meals in private rooms, suggesting that this activity continued at Kew, even if she didn't necessarily record it all the time. For example, several of the ladies in the equerries regularly joined each other for tea in either Burney's rooms or one of the other ladies' rooms. They sometimes took their own main meals separately, but the less formal ones of breakfast and tea often occurred in their apartments. And so there's lots of comings and goings, and people aren't always eating in the same place, even if the menus might suggest that they are. So food and diners were circulating throughout the residence during the course of the day. Despite the crowded nature of the household, these moments offered an opportunity to reinforce one's personal social bonds in a more private setting. So although the menus might appear to be a list of food, they hint at matters of bodily health and sociability. By reading the menus alongside other documents, such as the diaries of Fanny Burney or floor plans, it becomes possible to situate the menus within a broader context. The menu's reflections of social studies that our project has been looking at are only the tip of the iceberg. Much more remains to be uncovered. For example, looking at a wider range of dates for the menus will help to show the ways in which seasonality and supply shape their diet. Gifts start to appear more often, looking at how gifts reflected shifting friendships or significant events, as well as thinking about the roles of intimacy and distancing, especially within this royal household and how it fits within the history of the household in general. So the royal menus then are much more than lists of food. By thinking about them in terms of gender status, health and space, such a list ends up providing privileged insight into the daily workings of a household. Thank you.
Brilliant. You can probably stay where you are because we're just around the table. So thank you both so much for two wonderful papers, and it was wonderful to see in that wonderful way, and I had various questions rising up in Rachel's paper that Lisa then comes and complicates them and then develops them, which is really wonderful to see. Yeah, we've got plenty of time, so anyone want to start with anything you want to ask one of our speakers?
I was wondering if they're transporting food from the kitchen up as far as Princesses on Kew Green. Is there any facility there to reheat it, or is it just, you know,
That's a
as
good
it arrives
question,
and
and
the servant legs it as fast as they can?
we don't know yet. We've started talking to the people at the royal palaces to figure out more details, because they've done quite a bit of archaeological work, but it's still a bit preliminary to figure out all of those exact specifics. But it's on our list.
I'll jump in if anyone has a minute. You can all develop questions. My question's about bread. I didn't see it very. Like, does it feature on the menus? And it doesn't. And like, if it doesn't, or if it does, kind of what kind of bread is there? Because as we know, that is like the staple kind of energy source in the diet. And what role is it playing in this particular household? Where might it be? Like from other sources, where might it be being produced? Are they buying it in? Are they able to bake it themselves? And I'm just wondering as well, are there like national cuisine differences in breads we might be like seeing at the same time in different varieties through that?
I mean, the bread doesn't kind of show up very clearly.
It's not in those documents.
Yeah,
but
it's elsewhere.
There's another officer who's responsible for the bread and the wine and the candles. So it's not the clerk of the kitchen, basically.
Is it just taken for granted the bread would be there, so you don't mention it?
It's someone else's responsibility. So this document is created by the clerk of the kitchen to prove that he's not embezzling money. So because bread isn't his purview, it doesn't show up in that document. It's someone else's document that was responsible for it. So it is recorded just as carefully as this is.
So they could be sort of merged together potentially with some difficulty, I guess, those different documents to sort of form a wider picture.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Does that cover the same sort of space of time as well? So do you have quite good complete records, or is there gaps?
Yeah, we just have to kind of piece it all together bit by bit, because in terms of what the clerk of the kitchen records, the servants are literally just eating chunks of meat, right? And which at first when I saw it, I actually thought, oh, like that's so weird. But obviously they're not. They're also eating bread and vegetables. It's just that those aren't part of what is on this document. So it's going to be a bit of work, I think.
There's nothing to drink on these documents.
Yeah, no, that's right. Tea and things.
And beer as well, isn't it?
I was just going to say some of the dishes actually did have bread in them. So the sandwiches, it's implied there, but also a number of the soups are served with bread.
So do you think bread appears as flour and barm, or as bought in, or both?
Do we know that yet?
Not sure.
Don't really know that
Well,
yet.
I was just wondering about the wonderful maps we have and plans of the palace buildings itself. Like, is there an oven? Is there room for a bread oven?
Is there a bakery? Yeah.
Is there a bakery? And also, is there a brew house as well? The same kind of thing.
Well, there's a confectioner, isn't there?
Must be different.
Who's someone different, but
I'd be surprised if there wasn't one. The only problem is that the original site of the kitchen is gone, so that the one that's in Kew Palace now is not. It's a kitchen, but it's not that kitchen. Yeah.
You would think they would have a bakehouse.
You would think so.
You think Peter Brewer's might know, actually.
Yeah.
Following up on the bread question, very late 18th century, there were actually royal proclamations telling people to eat less bread and eat less flour. I wonder whether the King's kitchen towed the line, or in terms of using less bread in dishes or less flour, pastries and stuff.
Yeah, and I don't think we know that, because with the lists, it's interesting that they are just, you don't know what went into it. Like it's a name of a dish. And we're trying to link them up with what kind of what those recipes would look like in a published cookbook. But obviously, at this point, I don't think we know what recipes they were using there, or whether they were toning things up or down, or, that kind of thing. We just literally know what they called the dishes. And I think that's interesting. And I'm sort of curious about, because a lot of things are things that were, like I said, in the published cookbooks, but are they the same? I don't know.
You showed table plan from Mrs. Ruffles' book. And Georgian cookery books generally show, well, it depends on the book, it varies quite a bit, but there's a lack of vegetables in the table plan. And there's also a popular idea that Georgians ate meat and hardly any vegetables. As soon as you come to a gardening book, though, you suddenly, you realise that they had a much wider range of vegetables than we have. And of course they were forcing vegetables as well and eating out of season, which we do by importing, but they did by forcing. And I wondered whether, in fact, the vegetables were considered sort of lower status and didn't really appear on the table plan, even though they might be there, because you will sometimes see something like peas or broccoli or that sort. But basically, it's meats, a whole range of different meats in this table plan. And I've always wondered whether that's the case, whether in fact they simply weren't worth recording, but they were there, or whether in fact they weren't there. But then that doesn't correspond with the gardening books, because they're producing all these vegetables, but not mentioning them.
Yeah. I mean, but on the ledger...
Can you make sense of it?
There's a lot of vegetables, and, you know, what we don't know is what vegetables the servants and the grooms and stuff ate, because that's not written down. But at the, high-end tables, there's a lot of vegetables, and they appear regularly, and I think, as you suggested, they are growing them on site a lot and nearby and on their other lands. And George is interested in agriculture, of course, so
yes,
I think it's important to him as well. But I mean, if your question is about why they don't put them on the table plan,
it's because you had Elizabeth Ruffles, and she worked on a great estate, and although she had a separate career later on, and the success of her book, but so she would have had access to probably as much as anybody who's growing vegetables. It's not just gardening books, but the gardening books make it quite clear that they were being grown, prolific. So there is an anomaly there, and whichever books you look in, nothing actually hints at a solution to this problem. But it is a problem. It is a historical problem. I just wondered whether you could throw any light on it, and possibly not. I don't know.
There's one thing that I can think of, which is that they buy a lot of cucumbers, but if you look at what they're never serving the cucumbers. So obviously they are using them, or somebody's eating them in some way. So I think there's probably a lot of stuff that is green or
they
red.
were buying it in, but it doesn't appear in what you
There's
know.
nothing obviously that this has the cucumbers in it. So somebody somewhere is eating them somewhere.
Yeah.
Or an animal could also be animal feed.
Yes.
Well. I don't know why they'd use cucumbers, but
it's
just another possibility. But.
I mean, those table plans, though, are so sort of stylized, right? And all these cookbooks are so plagiarized from one to... I know Mrs. Beeton is famous for her plagiarism, but actually...
Well, she's much later.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, everyone talks about, Mrs. Beeton, she plagiarized, but they're all copies of each other,
Hannah Glass actually got ripped off really badly.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Ruffles made damn sure it wasn't going to happen to her, because what happened was the other authors passed their recipes to the printers, who then were selling them to rival publishers. Having been a publisher myself, I know what goes on. But the printers were doing this, and she didn't do that. She didn't let anybody see anything, and then she supplied the printer with the whole lot finished. And also, she only sold books to people who subscribed. And she signed every book herself to show it's authentic. So if you have the first edition anyway, you'd find her signature in it. That's quite normal. And consequently, she sold her books, and that was fine. She solved the problem. Copyright didn't apparently extend to cookery books, but I just don't see how these things can tally. And you look in all the cookery books, and as you say, those table plans, are stylised, but there is a basis of truth in it, because if visitors, especially from foreign visitors coming here, are noting the table layouts, we're accustomed to seeing a standard dish at one end and a standard other dish at the other end, and this sort of thing. So it's practice that we're following these things.
Right.
But I can only conclude that vegetables were just not of sufficient status to be worth including in the plan. Or
If they were growing them themselves, they also didn't have a cost in terms of these ledgers were economic.
no, they wouldn't have a cost.
So they wouldn't have
yes,
been
they'd be a sort of
getting approved to
gardening
use it.
cost or something.
Yeah.
But surely if it's à la française, there's a remove and dishes
Yeah.
are coming in and out.
You
Some
get
will be
that.
taken away, some will be...
Well, only principal dishes, I think.
Mm.
Or you think they may be part of the remove.
Mhm.
An entremet and things like
Yeah.
that are all...
Mm.
So it's like a kind of
Shunting.
like a running buffet that's
Yeah.
being constantly replenished. And there's certainly plenty of recipes, lovely looking recipes.
Yes, vegetables.
Vegetables,
Yes,
yeah.
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 Certainly I've looked at a particular menu book which is around the same period with one of the great Irish houses, and it's written by the cook in the house at the time and shows the layouts. And it does mention vegetables with the dishes, which wouldn't appear in something like Raphael's
Mhm.
plans
Yeah.
because it just wouldn't fit into the printing scheme. So I think they were there, very much there.
Yeah.
If you go back
yeah.
to the 17th century, you've got the grand sallas
Yes,
at every
salad
meal,
rolls and all
which
those.
isn't going to have just vanished and people
Yeah.
stop eating it.
Mm.
The way of presenting it might change. And that was supposed to have, was it 32 ingredients, the King's Gardener said.
Yeah, no, and I didn't pick Raffles for any special reason. It was just because I wasn't sure if they're, because sometimes if people don't know what Raffles says is, then they want to see the plan of it, like, so you can visualize it.
Mm. So the variety of meats that they ate together,
Mm-hmm.
one foreign visitor mentions trying to get them all onto the fork at the same time, all these different meats. Of course, you're not supposed to do that, but this is what he thought you were supposed to do. The vegetable, it's not a problem, but the notion that they ate mainly meat and not much in their vegetable, which is quite a popular notion, you find it in many books, it's wrong.
Yeah,
It's
I guess
completely
meat is
wrong.
the thing that like identifies them as.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
they wouldn't grow things they're not going to eat. I mean,
Right.
they grow prolifically. The varieties,
Yeah.
something like, see, strawberries, they've got about 20 or 30 different varieties, and some of them much more than that. And vegetables likewise.
Oh, that's interesting.
One thing I was surprised actually that there's not on there is fish, because you'd have thought fish would feature somewhere, or did it? And
Oh
I
no,
missed it.
fish does. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It does. It does at their Majesties' table and some of the other tables. It's
Very
just
common.
the servants don't ever get fish
Ah,
ever.
okay.
They only get those kinds of meat. But at their Majesties' table, there
Yeah,
is
And the
Yeah.
always
princesses
fish.
occasionally
Yeah,
get fish too.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Miss Goldsworthy.
yeah, she gets fish.
So
Then it's not surprising.
nothing preserved. No salt cod. No
Ah,
herring.
They don't necessarily
so.
specify that, do they?
Salt beef.
So yeah.
but salt cod, I haven't noticed that.
It's not referred to as salt cod. It might have been salted, but that's not how it's written down.
I'm only thinking because of the hospitals and workhouses and things in London. That's something that does happen. There's like a degree of discretion
Yeah.
for stewards to put some of that in, and like fish, when like mackerel, when it's in season, is one that like comes up repeatedly because it's in such a glut
Yeah.
every June and July. So it can,
You're placing this within a wider context within the country.
That is ultimately our goal.
Ultimately. Are you extending that to Ireland?
Within the realms of this particular project, with a very tight deadline, probably not. But we are thinking about it within the broader context of, Britain having colonies, and building this big
You're not supposed to
empire.
say that
You're
about
entering
Ireland.
dangerous
Yeah, sorry.
No,
So it is part of the
question.
relationship, but not
Yeah.
not on it, not specifically, but as part of the broader picture.
Because it was obviously standing from where I'm standing and studying that period from within
Yeah.
the island. It's. I mean, we were so focused. We who are we? We were so focused at looking across the water. It's just amazing not to see, in some ways, reflected back.
Well,
It'd be interesting to see. It's just nobody's ever looked at it.
We had a good conversation with Susan Flavin
Yeah.
about this, and she was pointing at a lot of similarities with the
Good
16th
use.
century, princely tables in Ireland, and the same songbirds are appearing and things like that. So I mean, I think there probably are some really interesting overlaps.
Well, yeah, because there would be
Yeah.
across the Clyde.
Yeah,
It would be
of
more
course.
national class than nationality.
Yeah.
But just it would be interesting. It'd be interesting to see it from your perspective, looking that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree, but we haven't
Part two.
got
Part
there
two.
yet. But I think it's a really welcome point, actually.
Yeah.
Well, especially given that it straddles the
Yeah.
Act of Union
Yeah,
and it straddles
exactly.
so many profound
It does.
political events that are still going on.
Absolutely.
It is.
And
Yeah.
conversations about Catholic emancipation, which
Yeah,
the king is
yeah.
so strongly against as well. So whether he'd be
and
wanting to
then
distance from that,
within
who knows?
Ireland, there was equally the sort of the dialogue about how you felt about French food. There was the Catholic, the Protestant, the Irish, the Anglo-Irish. There were a whole lot of other dialogues going on all around food.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking while you were talking about, the other Gillray picture of, what is it, liberty, the bread of liberty being force-fed around Europe. I don't know why it just popped into my head, but there's a lot of this food satire and the ethnicity surrounding the depictions of food.
And then insofar as there are accounts that you're looking at, aren't primarily?
Yeah, they're kind of like accounts, menu. They're a bit of a hybrid thing there. They're not strictly account books, I guess.
Just expenses, really, isn't it? It's an expense list.
Well, yeah, but they're menus, right? So they're not just about the expense. They're about the decisions about what it is. They have an aesthetic component in terms of, it's not just a shopping list. It's a decision each day. I think they get signed off the day before for the next day, what's going to be served. So they're not totally like account books in that really technical sense.
Does alcohol
Yeah.
appear anywhere? On
It
the
appears
It's a different
elsewhere.
list, yeah.
It's
Different-
someone else's job.
different list,
Yeah.
but for kitchen use, I mean, not just I suppose from the same.
They would have to get it from whoever was responsible.
Gotcha.
It says there's a book, a household list of rules, and it says who's responsible for what.
Right.
So it would be a matter of calling up procurement and filling in a form.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's the time scale on, you're saying that the day before they put out the menu, how far in advance are they organising the menus and kind of ordering stuff in that they need to and
Yeah.
being shot and
Yeah.
organising their gardening? Do you know how that...
I don't know, and I think, the grocery lists are what, once a month or something?
Only if they're going to be.
Only if they're going to be there, yeah, because that's the other thing is we only have at the moment the Kew ledger, and so it's a little bit episodic because it's only written down when they're there, obviously. But I guess other stuff like animal and vegetable food is a lot of it is theirs already because it's from their own lands. So we don't know about the buying of it because it's not technically being bought.
So they're in the menu.
They're in the menu
section.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're not specifically.
But they're not in the
mentioned as a
accounts.
purchase.
And that's what I mean is, so it's a weird thing because it's not just an account book, in which case it would
Yeah,
just
so
be the
half
mace and the
half,
cinnamon
yeah.
and stuff. But so we know they're making those decisions.
Yeah.
And then some of it is obviously dictated by this kind of weekly cycle of what the servants eat. Because whatever meat the servants are eating, all the servants are eating it, and it makes an appearance on the menu. So whatever they're cooking that day goes around. So I don't know, and that's on a regular pattern rota as far as we can tell. And then what they decide to go with it. Some of it is probably to do with health. Sometimes Dr. Willis is in the house because his servants are there, and he has a lot to say about what the king should eat. So yeah, it's a very pertinent question, and I don't think we're quite sure. And like, I mean, I'm very curious about this question of like whose tastes are being reflected at the table. Like how much is this just like standard what people eat, and how much is it specified around them? It's so far I find it a bit hard to tell like whose tastes are these for. Who's making the decision? I mean, I wouldn't like it if my dinners were decided by a committee.
Was there anything about the cooks? The cook or chief cook? Or?
Well, we know that there was a lot of German in the kitchen staff, but I don't think have any like memoirs or testimonies from people. It's just lists. So we're trying to kind of, dig deep into these lists and figure out what they might, who they represent. And the handwriting is pretty much the same for the ones I've looked at. I think towards the end it changes up a bit in the later years, but maybe not.
I haven't seen any change within that.
No. So the staff is pretty stable.
I think the existence of the humoral theory so late on is absolutely fascinating. The way you can trace that.
I mean, it was still a staple part of medicine until well into the 19th century.
I hadn't seen it quite so much still going through the food choices, but obviously it was, especially given his circumstances.
Yeah. I was thinking too, because I was reading Annie, it's Gray, isn't it? Yeah, Annie Gray's report for the palaces on, because they were looking at what was being eaten as well. And she pointed out that the issue of how the food's being delivered is also important, because Willis was known for force feeding, and there is a hint that perhaps there was some force feeding of the king as well. So then it raises all sorts of other interesting questions about, well, obviously that's going to be certain types of soups. It's probably going to be very nutritional soups. But the idea of force feeding a king is very complicated, right? It's a big thing.
Yeah, do a lot of reading around that.
Yeah.
Soups are a big thing on menus anyway, aren't they? There's 2 soups on every table.
And one is usually removed, isn't it, at some stage,
White soup at every bowl.
Yeah.
Love to taste white soup.
And does it give, if they were buying things in, have you come across the names of who was supplying them?
Yeah. They had an annual contract from January to January to supply a certain type of provision at a certain rate.
Because from looking at a lot of accounts equally, and I think that the account books outside are the greatest liars that you can possibly, or half-truth, they constantly tell you a half-truth while masquerading as telling you.
Yeah.
Fact isn't the truth very often. And it is, I realise now that a lot of the time it's the dialogue that I'm missing is books that they kept with those people who were supplying them, and they signed off, and they have the other half of the record very often that you seem to be you would seem to be missing when you're going through accounts. Like you can't account for the fact suddenly that maybe that these are obviously not as elite accounts, that suddenly tea disappears, and that they're still buying tea. So you have to kind of figure out that now they've changed a system. They're buying from a shop that they have the books, and they're a separate thing.
Okay.
And they very often don't survive. They are very much ephemeral.
Right.
So it's just so hard to piece a whole picture together that is there.
Yeah.
Agreed.
The retail records have disappeared, haven't they?
That's
the
other half of the conversation has disappeared because it's not in as important a place.
It's in most cases.
This is perhaps an unfair question, but what you've looked at so far with material, what do you think between you that this stuff might say about that big question of English cuisine and a sense of that, or the European, or is it more European than we think, or is there something distinctive about its inclusivity at a certain level of society? I
think it's very nicely international, isn't it? Compared to French food, British food is really it's very global,
Mhm.
you know, what the king ate, and I think what's in the cookbooks as well. I think impressively so. And again, you know, I think because somehow in the 20th century, British people convinced themselves that they had terrible food and that they had never reached out to Europe. I don't know where that came from, but you know, if you look at the cookbooks Lisa and I are looking at to compare to what's in the ledgers, is yeah, there's stuff from everywhere. It's amazing, the range of it, really. Very European, and then also a little bit beyond.
Mhm.
But I think that, and that's not exotic. You know, that's what's so interesting, is that that's just English food. Like, that's just British food. That's just ordinary in a way. I don't mean ordinary necessarily for like workers or country folk, but for like urban, increasingly affluent, middling people. The idea that, you know, that British food is global food seems to me to be quite present, and almost in a way that kind of isn't saying, you know, what I think some people have said, which is like, oh, the British were conscious of the empire through their daily life, but almost that because they thought of that as British, they weren't conscious of it, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
You mentioned Turkish dishes, and were they any resemblance to Turkish dishes, or is it just given that name to give it a bit of a
Well, it's grilled meat, isn't it?
Oh,
Yeah. But that's the same with like a lot of, you know, like all the French dishes that have French names. I mean, in what way does that make them French? It's not, you know.
Well, there's some rich people, I mean, it's not completely unknown for them to get themselves a French cook.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Leave it all to him.
Yeah. But whether the Turkish food is particularly Turkish.
Would a Turk recognise it?
I wouldn't vouch for that. I mean, I suppose they're doing what they can with the things they have, right? But it's always, you know, even if we want to say, well, isn't it interesting that all sorts of people chose to spend their discretionary spending on things like cinnamon and mace and whatever these spices were, at the same time, that's what they had. And so when you read the recipes for the Turkish things and the Indian things and stuff in the recipe books, they're still using this fairly limited palette, just in slightly different proportions, I guess. Does that seem like what you've observed as well, or am I being unfair?
I mean, I think one of the big standouts, though, is how 18th century flavors in particular are they feel more Middle Eastern if you look at the flavorings than we would eat today. And so then it's not a far stretch to think about, you know, maybe having things from India or Turkey would actually fit their taste buds quite nicely. But yeah, I mean, the number of, even going back into the 17th century, it's very, you know, spicy, but not hot spicy, but richly spicy.
Well, the spices go back.
Yeah,
before then.
but it's also that sort of mixture of sweet and savoury too that they lose at some point, but is still present on the table in the late 18th century.
Well, the things, I've got East India Company glossary, which is issued to 1779, thereabouts anyway. Issued to people, obviously, who were going to go out to India for the company and to learn some Indian words. And there are the food is mentioned in that, or something like ghee or something, you know. So they're obviously needing to know about it, but there's quite a lot of traffic of people going out to India, and if they didn't die, they were coming back again. So they would have brought back what they were eating out there, and it certainly involved strong spices and things like that.
You could imagine coming back and thinking, well, I enjoyed the mango